To have you live for this last hour, and I want to thank you at home for being with us as well as our live coverage continues. For context here, this was the news in America not all that many weeks ago this year. This spring, in April, a group of far-right anti-government protesters took up positions against law enforcement at the Bundy Ranch in rural Nevada. And when I say they took up positions against law enforcement, I mean it literally. The protesters aimed sniper rifles from a bridge at those officers. Supporters of that Nevada rancher said they would not leave. They ran armed patrols on site. Those far-right anti-government protesters would not go. They made a show of their many weapons. They said they were prepared to use those weapons, and what they meant by that was that they were prepared to use them against law enforcement officers. And the response to this by law enforcement was that law enforcement backed off. They basically decided to let the situation de-escalate rather than insist that those anti-government protesters move. Rather than trying to force their way through those protesters, they backed off. They said, let's de-escalate this thing. We don't want anybody to get hurt. The protesters responded by declaring victory. They had brought out their guns and they got what they wanted. That standoff in Nevada unfolded in April, again, just weeks ago. Contrast that with news tonight in America. Yes, this is another standoff tonight in a different state, but law enforcement is treating this one very, very differently. This one is mostly African-American community protesters in Ferguson, Missouri, out in the streets of their own community calling for justice for an unarmed black teenager who was killed by police this weekend in Ferguson. Protesters out for a fourth night in a row now with their hands in the air. Hands up, don't shoot. Hands up, don't shoot has become the unofficial slogan of these 4 straight nights of sometimes very angry protest. But in this standoff, law enforcement at the scene have not been backing down. They're not backing down. They've been advancing more and more aggressively. Police tonight in Ferguson, Missouri, made some remarkable television when they opened fire with tear gas canisters and what were described by people on the scene as flash grenades and rubber bullets. Witnesses describe a police response that spilled out into the surrounding neighborhoods as well, away from the protests, onto the front lawns, and up to the front doors of people who live nearby. At this hour, we are approaching the start of the 5th day of protest in Ferguson, Missouri, since the police killing of Michael Brown. This morning, officials in Ferguson posted a statement asking for any protests to happen only during daylight hours, asking protesters to disperse well before the evening hours. But it didn't seem to help even when people did that. This protest began during broad daylight today, and police showed up in more than full riot gear, SWAT gear, driving an armored military vehicle with a roof-mounted gun. Reporters on the scene say law enforcement directly trained their guns on the protesters. They ended up arresting and then releasing 2 reporters who were not there to protest, who were not engaged in any sort of civil disobedience or any confrontation with police. Ryan Riley from Huffington Post, Wesley Lauer from the Washington Post were both grabbed by police in the local McDonald's that have become kind of a media center, essentially a de facto newsroom for reporters who've been covering the story, who need a place from which they can access Wi-Fi.